Hi there, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the institutional review boards. We already did some of this when we talked about regulations, but we're going to sort of talk about the real, what is an IRB, how do you deal with it, what are they like? So what is an IRB? That's the good basic starting question. And so out of the code we have any board, committee, or group formally designated by an institution to review and approve the initiation of and to conduct periodic review of biomedical research involving human subjects. The primary purpose of such review is to assure the protection of the rights and welfare of the human subjects. And I added the emphasis to this. You have to remember when you're dealing with an IRB, the only thing they really care about is that you're protecting the rights and welfare of the people on your trial. So once you understand what their mission is, you start to really get an idea of why they're doing what they're doing, and it makes a lot more sense once you look at it from that angle. History of the IRB, relatively recent. It wasn't until 1974 that IRBs existed at all in this country. And in that year, IRBs were required for all government-sponsored research. So if you had federal funding for a trial then, beginning with the Act of 1974, you needed an IRB. And now applies to all research involving humans, regardless of where the funding comes from. It is regulated by the Office of Human Research Protections within the Department of Health and Human Services. So the OHRP, if you're really interested, the OHRP has a pretty cool website, and they are the federal agency that's in charge of all of the IRBs in the country. If you worked for an IRB, you would be very interested in the OHRP. But it's just helpful for a research coordinator to know that the IRBs have some oversight, like who's policing the police kind of thing. IRB is a generic term. It is really common in this country. People use that term all the time to mean, you know, your institutional review board, but you can hear other things such as independent ethics committee. That's more of a European Union kind of term, or an ethical review board, ERB. So it can be called anything. IRB is just sort of the term that we use in this country, but you could find other terms. No matter what you call it, though, the objective is always the same. It never varies. It is always the safety of human subjects participating in clinical trials. So there are types of IRBs, and they are based, we would categorize them based on an affiliation with the investigator. So the two really basic categorizations of IRBs is the local one, the first one, very, very common. The local IRB exists in situations where the investigator is affiliated with an institution and therefore it's IRB. If I was at University Hospital, I was an investigator performing a trial at University Hospital, I would be associated with the Health Science Center IRB. If I was an investigator at the Cancer Therapy and Research Center, I would be associated with the UT Health Science Center IRB. Northwest Vista College has an IRB. So every institution where there could be human research will have an IRB. So hospitals and universities is really what I'm talking about. However, that doesn't help the investigator who's in a private practice and doesn't maybe have an association with a university or hospital. Ophthalmologists are a great example of that. Dermatologists sometimes. So we call those independent IRBs. And they exist in situations in which the investigator practices without institutional affiliation. A private practice that doesn't have hospital privileges, dedicated research clinics where they do everything in their clinic. So they would have an independent IRB. Independent IRBs sometimes get called for-profit IRBs because they are businesses that exist. In the case of the local IRB, the Health Science Center, for example, or Northwest Vista College, those organizations understand that they need to have IRBs as part of their function. And so the IRBs exist. In the independent affiliation, those IRBs fill a void where there is no local affiliation. And so in that respect, they are as if they were businesses. And some of them have not done a good job, and there have been some cases in recent history where the independent IRBs have really fallen down on the job, and so they don't necessarily have the same favorable view among a lot of people in clinical research, but they can be very, very good, and they can do just as good a job as local IRB. The IRB membership, you have to have at least 5 members. You're always going to want to have an odd number because that prevents a tie in voting. You're going to want to have more than 5 members in case someone isn't available, because you have to have at least 5 members to vote. 1 member has to be unaffiliated with the institution. So a good example is Northwest Vista College. We have an IRB member from the UTSA. 1 member must be a lay person. Methodist Hospital, Santa Rosa, those kinds of those sort of religious affiliation facilities oftentimes will have the lay person be one of the clergy. But a lay person is just someone who doesn't have a scientific background. And then if you have a lay person, then you want to have someone that does have a scientific background. It doesn't have to be a doctor, but an MD oftentimes is needed to satisfy professional competency of the IRB. So you can have more than 1 person with a scientific background, and it typically will be at least one physician. The membership has to be diverse. And the diversity is what gives sort of some of the authority and the power to the IRB, because that diversity allows people to look at things from a different angle. So the membership has to be diverse, and it's written in the law to be that way. So the key role of the IRB I mentioned earlier is to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects. And these 2 important questions helps the IRB do this. So if you understand these questions, you'll understand why they're asking what they're asking. Is the study acceptable for human participation? Is it a properly designed protocol? Are the risks to subjects minimized? Is it a favorable risk to benefit ratio? Is there enough potential benefit on here to be able to justify the risks? And so these are the kinds of things that the IRB looks at in order to answer the question, is the study acceptable for human participation? They also want to know, is the study objective, is it scientifically sound? And the next question they have is, does the consent process safeguard participants? So this is why they look at the protocol and they look at the consent form. Those are the 2 big questions the IRB has. And if you understand that, you'll understand some of the smaller questions that they're asking. So the IRB responsibilities is to approve clinical research studies. This is what they can do, or to require modifications to studies, or to disapprove studies. So those are the 3 things really the IRB is going to do. And I mentioned before that 9 times out of 10, the first time they look at a new study, they will require some modifications to it. They also communicate with investigators in writing of the decisions. The IRB, especially if it's a local IRB, you'll start to know people at the IRB over the phone, and they might call you or you might call them, and you'll have discussions, and they'll say things like, the IRB voted this morning to approve the study. And that's just sort of a courtesy kind of thing. Formally, the IRB has to communicate in writing of its decisions, so there can be no question about what they decided. Another responsibility of the IRB is to require that information given to subjects in the informed consent is compliant with the Code of Federal Regulations, including, is it understandable? The IRB can also require you make sure that the sites document the informed consent. Another responsibility is they have the right to observe or have a third party observe the consent process. So your IRB could say, you know, we have questions and we're not really sure you guys are doing a good job, so we want to have somebody observe the consent process. You cannot deny that request. And the IRB is also going to conduct continuing review of the research. I've made mention to this before. The IRB won't say, okay, stamp, you're approved, good luck. They're going to want continuing review of the research. At a very minimum, it's on an annual basis. If it's really risky research, it might be more frequent than that. So some key IRB points in the informed consent and the process Subjects have to consent before they are enrolled. There has to be some provisions for ongoing safety monitoring. If the IRB is really concerned about the safety and the rights and the welfare of the participants, they might ask for ongoing safety monitoring. The informed consent also can give provisions for subject privacy and HIPAA compliance. In the informed consent, any payments, and they're going to have some discussions with you, must be considered reasonable. Now that varies by region. So if you work in Boston and then you get a job in San Francisco or Los Angeles, you might find that locally what reasonable payments are can change. But the IRB wants to know if you're giving payments to someone that they are quote unquote reasonable, because a very excessive payments can be considered to be coercive, and we know that we don't want to be coercive in the process. And advertisements must be non-coercive. We'll talk about advertisements later in the semester because we're going to talk about recruiting participants, but the advertisements cannot sort of lure people unreasonably to participate. The IRB gets really interested in vulnerable populations too. We're going to talk more about vulnerable populations if you take the ethics class. But vulnerable is just sort of considered to be a group of people that you could potentially take advantage of because of their circumstances. Children, definitely, because children do not have full decision-making authority, and they don't, they're developing. Pregnant women are considered vulnerable. Prisoners, if you ever work in a clinical trial where some of the participants are going to be incarcerated individuals, those are considered vulnerable. Handicapped, mentally disabled, people with acute or severe mental illness, educationally disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged, people who are institutionalized. Your IRB will be very interested in knowing about these people and making sure you're not taking advantage of them. Also, employees of the research site. Employees of research sites really should not be participating by and large in clinical research because it becomes very confusing about how much coercion might exist for that person to be participating in their clinical trial. And also students of an affiliated organization. I actually did a little research study here. It was regarding direct-to-consumer advertisements, and I used students from Northwest Vista College among my, it wasn't exclusively students, but among my participants, and I made sure that none of the students were in my classes, and that I was not directly involved in teaching them or grading them at the time they participated. So there's a lot of different things you have to be careful with if they're students. The investigator and the IRB. So the investigator is going to be dealing directly with the IRB. I said before, the study sponsor, not so much. And the investigator is going to have to submit the following things to the IRB. And when I say investigator, what I really mean is a clinical research coordinator. At the end of the day, it's the investigator's responsibility, but this responsibility gets delegated to you. So these are the things the IRB wants to look at when they are considering whether you could be approved for a study. The form FDA 1572, the statement of the investigator, we talked about that in the previous module. The CV, the curriculum vitae, or in other words, the resume for the principal investigator and all the sub-investigators, and that's what I mean by sub-I. So sub-investigators. So there's one principal investigator, but there might be 5 other doctors working on the study. So the curriculum vitae, the CV for them, the protocol that's been given to you by the sponsor. Now the investigator brochure, we haven't spoken about this yet, but the investigator brochure is required by law to be provided to you by the sponsor. The investigator brochure is basically a document that says everything that's known about that drug up to this date. The investigator brochure is updated annually by the sponsor. So this is important for you to have, but you will not create it. So that's really good news. whenever you get a prescription filled and you get this big piece of paper inside the prescription and you open it up like a map and it's huge and it has pharmacology data and how the drug is manufactured and how it's administered. If you've ever read that, all of that information comes from the investigator's brochure. So it's sort of like the package insert before a drug is approved. So it's very, very thorough. Any advertising that's going to be used to find and recruit participants has to be made aware to the IRB. The proposed informed consent form. Now, I say proposed because I've never heard of the IRB, in my experience, accepting a consent form without some type of modification. So the sponsor oftentimes is going to write the basic consent form, and then you might have to modify it for the IRB. The investigator's responsibilities, which is sort of your responsibilities, right? There has to be some things, there's ongoing conversations with the IRB, and these things have to be reported to the IRB. Any changes to the protocol. I mentioned before that it could be revised, so if the protocol has any revision to it, the new version has to go to the IRB. Also, the IRB needs to know about anything that increases the potential for risks. So it might be, if you're doing a phase 1 study, there still might be some preclinical research that's ongoing. And so you might find something out in one of those animal models that has to be told to the IRB because the risks are increased. So anything that increases the risk. Serious adverse events, which we'll talk about also later in the semester, the IRB has to know about them. And then unanticipated events. And we'll talk more about those when we talk about serious adverse events. So after the IRB approves a study, there's going to be some ongoing discussion. They're going to want a continuing review at least once a year, but they're going to want to know about these things as they come up. And then there's going to be those progress reports, which I mentioned, the continuing review. The intervals will be stated in the initial approval letter, at least annually, maybe more frequently if it's a risky study. The key points for the principal investigator when relating to the IRB is that the PI is responsible for obtaining IRB approval. The sponsor will not be dealing with the IRB, you will be. The study has to be approved in writing. Now your local IRB will always do that in writing, but if for some strange reason you were dealing with an independent IRB and they gave you a phone call, you would ask them to follow up in writing. The study absolutely cannot start prior to IRB approval. You might have potential participants that are interested, all sorts of things set up, everything ready and waiting to go, but you cannot do a thing until the IRB gives you the green light. And then the PI and the research coordinator are responsible for that ongoing IRB relationship. You can pick up the phone and call them. They will be a wonderful resource for you, but they need to be able to trust that you're going to manage things what I talked about, like serious adverse events and things like that. So you're responsible for that IRB relationship. Here are the references, always Code of Federal Regulations, and then our great friend Karen Wood. I'd be happy to answer any questions as you have them, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.